Have you ever felt someone slowly drifting away from you? But you couldn't explain why. Not because of a fight. Not because of something obvious. Just distance. Their energy changes. Their responses get shorter. The warmth that used to be there feels different now. And the hardest part? They don't say anything. So you start thinking, did I do something wrong? Did I miss something? Why does this feel different when nothing actually happened? You replay conversations in your head. You analyze small details. You look for a moment where things shifted. But you can't find it. Because there's no clear reason. And that's what makes it so frustrating. Because when there's no clear problem, there's nothing to fix. So you try anyway. You try to be better. More understanding. More available. More careful with your words. You adjust yourself, without even realizing it. Hoping that somehow, things will go back to how they were. But instead, it feels like the more you try, the more distant they become. And now something else shows up. A quiet tension. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just there. In the pauses. In the way they respond. In the way you start second-guessing yourself. And deep down, you feel it. Something is off. But no one is saying it. And that silence is heavier than any argument could ever be. Because at least with an argument, you know what you're dealing with. But this? This feels invisible. Unspoken. Unclear. And yet, real. So you stay in it. Trying to understand. Trying to fix. Trying to hold on to something that feels like it's slowly slipping. And maybe the most uncomfortable question of all starts to form. Not loudly. But quietly. What if the reason they're pulling away is something I can't see? Not something you said. Not something you did. But something else. Something harder to notice. Something you've been carrying, without even realizing it. Before anything else, you need to hear this clearly. This is not happening because you're a bad person. It's not because you're careless. It's not because you don't try enough. And it's definitely not because something is wrong with you. In fact, the opposite is often true. You care. That's why you notice the distance. That's why you replay conversations. That's why you try to adjust yourself, to make things better. Someone who didn't care wouldn't even feel this. So no, this isn't about you being the problem. But it is about something you were never taught to see. Because most people were never taught how their inner world affects others. You were taught how to behave. How to speak. How to act appropriately. But no one really explained what's happening underneath all of that. No one told you that people don't just respond to your words. They respond to what they feel in your presence. And that part? It's mostly unconscious. Not just for you. For everyone. Which means a lot of what's happening between people is happening without either side fully understanding it. And when you don't understand something, you try to control it in the only way you know how. You adjust your behavior. You become more careful. More thoughtful. More aware of how you might be coming across. And again, this doesn't come from manipulation. It comes from a good place. From wanting things to feel right again. From wanting connection, not distance. But here's where it gets complicated. Because when you start adjusting yourself from a place of uncertainty, you're not actually creating comfort. You're creating pressure. Not visible pressure. Not something you can point to. But something that can be felt. And the difficult part is, you don't even realize you're doing it. You think you're helping. You think you're improving the situation. But underneath all of that, there's a subtle tension. A need for things to go a certain way. A hope that your effort will bring things back. A quiet fear that if it doesn't, something might be lost. And that fear? It doesn't stay inside you. It shows up, in ways you can't always see. In your tone. In your timing. In your energy. Even in your silence. And again, this is not your fault. Because no one taught you how to notice that. No one taught you how powerful your internal state actually is. So you did what most people do. You focused on what's visible. Words. Actions. Behavior. Because that's what you were trained to manage. But the invisible part, the internal part. That's where most of the real communication happens. And if no one ever showed you that, how could you possibly be aware of it? You couldn't. So instead, you learned to compensate. To try harder. To give more. To be more understanding, more patient, more accommodating. And while those things seem positive, when they come from a place of tension, they don't feel the way you intend them to. They don't land as warmth. They don't land as ease. They often land as something else. Something harder to define. Something the other person might not even be able to explain. They just feel off. And when people feel something they can't explain, they don't analyze it. They respond to it. They pull back. They create space. They become less engaged. Not because they've decided something logically, but because something emotionally doesn't feel right. And that's where the confusion begins. Because from your perspective, you're doing everything right. You're being kind. You're being present. You're trying. So when the response you get doesn't match that, it feels unfair. It feels confusing. It feels like something is missing. And the truth is, something is missing. But it's not what you think. It's not more effort. It's not more adjustment. It's not more trying. It's awareness. Awareness of what's happening beneath everything you're doing. Because once you see that, you stop blaming yourself for the wrong reasons. And you stop trying to fix things in ways that were never going to work. And that's where everything begins to shift. Not by becoming someone else, but by finally understanding what's been there all along. Most people believe that relationships are shaped by what you say and what you do. So when something feels off, they immediately focus on fixing those two things. They choose their words more carefully. They adjust their behavior. They try to say the right things at the right time. And on the surface, that makes sense. Because words are visible. Actions are visible. They feel controllable. So naturally, that's where your attention goes. But here's the problem. What's visible is not what people are responding to most. Think about it. Have you ever had a conversation with someone who said all the right things, but something still felt off? Nothing was technically wrong. No harsh words. No obvious issue. And yet, you felt it. A subtle discomfort. A lack of ease. A feeling you couldn't quite explain. That's because communication doesn't start with words. It starts with state. And this is where most people go wrong without realizing it. They try to fix external behavior, while the internal state stays the same. So even though the words change, the feeling doesn't. And people don't respond to the words. They respond to the feeling. This is why overthinking often makes things worse. Because when you overthink, you're not just thinking more. You're creating pressure. Pressure to say the right thing. Pressure to avoid mistakes. Pressure to control the outcome. And that pressure doesn't stay inside your mind. It shows up. In your tone. In your timing. In the way you hold yourself. Even in the pauses between your words. So while you believe you're improving the situation, you're actually intensifying the very thing that feels off. But you don't see it that way. Because from your perspective, you're doing everything you can. You're trying harder. You're being more careful. You're putting in more effort. And effort feels like progress. But in this case, effort without awareness creates resistance. Another common mistake? Trying to manage how the other person feels. You start monitoring their reactions. You notice small changes in tone. You analyze their responses. You try to predict what they might be thinking. And then you adjust yourself, based on that. Not consciously, but subtly. You become slightly more cautious. Slightly more controlled. Slightly less natural. And over time, that shift becomes noticeable. Not in an obvious way, but in a felt way. Because when you're focused on managing someone else's perception, you're no longer present. You're performing. And people can feel that. Even if they can't explain it. It feels less real. Less grounded. Less easy. So what do? They pull back. Not because you said something wrong, but because something doesn't feel natural anymore. And this creates a cycle. You notice the distance. So you try harder. You become more aware of yourself. So you become less natural. You try to fix the connection. But the more you try, the more strained it becomes. And eventually, you reach a point where nothing seems to work. Because you're solving the wrong problem. You think the issue is communication. But it's not. You think the issue is behavior. But it's not. The issue is the state behind everything you're doing. And as long as that state stays the same, no amount of perfect words will fix it. No amount of effort will change it. Because the foundation hasn't shifted. And people always feel the foundation. This is why sometimes doing less actually changes more. Not because less effort is better, but because less pressure is. When you stop trying to control every interaction. When you stop analyzing every detail. When you stop adjusting yourself constantly. Something begins to open. Your presence becomes lighter. Your communication becomes natural. Your energy becomes easier to be around. And suddenly, the same words you were saying before start landing differently. Not because the words changed, but because the state behind them did. And this is the part most people never consider. They believe connection is built through what they do. But in reality, it's shaped by what they are while they're doing it. And until that shifts, nothing else fully will. So the real question isn't, what should I say differently? It's, what am I bringing into this, without realizing it? There is a principle that quietly operates beneath every interaction you have. It's not something most people are taught directly. It's not something you learn in school. But once you see it, you begin to notice it everywhere. It's this. People do not respond to what you say as much as they respond to what you feel. Not consciously, but deeply. Automatically. This idea was explored by Joseph Murphy, who explained that the subconscious mind is always active, always communicating, even when no words are being spoken. According to his teachings, your dominant thoughts and emotions don't stay contained inside you. They project outward. And others, whether they realize it or not, pick up on them. Not logically, but intuitively. You've experienced this before. Walking into a room and immediately sensing tension. Without anyone saying a word. Meeting someone for the first time and feeling at ease. Or slightly uncomfortable, without knowing why. That's not imagination. That's perception at a deeper level. Because beneath conscious communication, there is another layer. A constant exchange of emotional signals. And those signals come from your internal state. Not your words. Not your behavior. But the feeling behind them. This is the hidden law most people overlook. Your inner state becomes your outer communication. And others respond to it instantly. Even if they can't explain it. Joseph Murphy described this in a simple way. What you impress upon your subconscious mind is expressed in your life and reflected back through others. Which means, if your internal state carries tension, that tension doesn't stay hidden. It's felt. If your internal state carries uncertainty, that uncertainty becomes part of your presence. And if your internal state carries a need for approval, others feel that too. Not as a clear thought, but as a subtle emotional signal. And here's what makes this so important. People don't analyze these signals. They react to them. They don't sit and think. Something about this person feels pressured. They just feel slightly uncomfortable. They don't think. This person is internally uncertain. They just feel less grounded around you. And because they don't understand why they feel that way, they respond in simple ways. They create space. They become less engaged. They pull back slightly. Not as a decision, but as a reaction. And from your perspective, this feels confusing. Because you're focused on what you said, what you did, how you acted. But they're responding to something deeper. Something unspoken. Something constant. Your state. This is why two people can say the exact same words and create completely different reactions. One feels natural. The other feels forced. One feels calm. The other feels heavy. Not because of the words, but because of the energy behind them. And this is where the principle becomes clear. Life doesn't respond to your effort. It responds to your inner condition. Your relationships. Your interactions. Even the way people treat you are influenced by the state you consistently carry. Not occasionally, but consistently. Because your dominant state becomes predictable. And people begin to respond to that pattern without thinking. If your state is grounded and calm, people feel safe around you. If your state is tense and uncertain, people feel that too. And again, this is not something you're doing intentionally. It's happening automatically. Which is why so many people feel stuck. They try to change outcomes without realizing what's actually creating them. They adjust their behavior without adjusting the state behind it. And because of that, nothing fully shifts. But once you understand this law, something important changes. You stop trying to control people. And you start paying attention to what you're bringing into the interaction. You begin to notice your internal patterns. The subtle tension. The quiet need for things to go a certain way. The underlying fear of losing connection. And instead of trying to fix the outside, you become aware of the inside. Because that's where the real influence is. Not in what you say, but in what you silently carry. And once you see that clearly, you start to understand something most people miss. You've been communicating far more than you realized. Even when you weren't saying anything at all. Now we can finally see it clearly. They're struggling silently, and you're the reason. Not in the way you might think. Not because you're doing something wrong on the surface. Not because you intended to hurt them. But because of what you've been unconsciously projecting. Because while you've been focusing on your words, your behavior, your effort, something else has been speaking much louder. Your internal state. And that state has been shaping how they feel around you. Without you realizing it. Without them fully understanding it. This is the part that changes everything. Because the struggle they're experiencing is not always about what's happening externally. It's about what they're feeling internally, in your presence. And that feeling is influenced by you. Not by what you say, but by what you carry. If there is tension inside you, they feel pressure. If there is uncertainty inside you, they feel instability. If there is a need for control, they feel restricted. And none of this needs to be spoken out loud. It's felt. Quietly. Subtly. But consistently. So from their side, something feels off. But they can't explain it. They don't sit there and think, this person is internally tense. They just feel less relaxed. Less open. Less connected. And because they don't understand the source of that feeling, they don't confront it. They don't explain it. They don't analyze it. They simply adjust. They pull back slightly. They become less expressive. They create emotional space. Not as a conscious decision, but as a natural response. And this is why it feels so confusing to you. Because from your perspective, you've been trying. You've been showing up. You've been putting in effort. You've been doing what you believe is right. So when they start pulling away, it feels unexpected. Unfair, even. Because you're measuring your actions. But they're responding to your state. And those are not the same thing. This is the hidden disconnect. You think you're giving more. But what they feel is pressure. You think you're being careful. But what they feel is tension. You think you're trying to fix things. But what they feel is something that doesn't allow them to relax. And over time, that creates silent struggle. Not loud arguments. Not obvious conflict. But internal discomfort. A feeling they can't fully explain. A weight they don't know how to describe. So they stay quiet. They don't bring it up. Because there's nothing concrete to point to. And instead of expressing it, they distance themselves from it. Which means, they distance themselves from you. Not because they want to hurt you, but because they're trying to find ease again. And this is where the truth becomes clear. They're not reacting to your intentions. They're reacting to your presence. And your presence is shaped by your inner state. This is why forcing connection never works. Because force always carries tension. And tension is felt. This is why over-explaining never fixes things. Because explanation doesn't remove pressure. Only state does. And this is why trying harder often makes things worse. Because effort, when driven by fear, intensifies the very feeling that creates distance. So the shift is not in doing more. It's in becoming aware. Aware of what you're bringing into the interaction. Not externally, but internally. Because the moment your state changes, their experience changes. Not because you convinced them. Not because you explain something better. But because what they feel around you is different. And that's the real power here. Not control. Not effort. But awareness. Because once you see this, you stop trying to fix people. And you start understanding how your internal world is quietly shaping theirs. And in that understanding, everything begins to shift. A man once told me something that stayed with me. He said, I don't understand it. I'm doing everything right, but she feels further away than ever. He wasn't careless. In fact, he was the opposite. He paid attention. He listened carefully. He chose his words with precision. He tried to be supportive, present, and understanding. But the more he tried, the more distant things became. Conversations felt heavier. Moments felt less natural. And eventually, silence started replacing connection. From his perspective, it didn't make sense. Because if effort creates closeness, he should have been closer than ever. But when we looked deeper, something else became clear. Underneath all his effort, there was tension. A constant need to get it right. A quiet fear of losing the connection. A subtle pressure to fix what he felt slipping. And even though he never said those things out loud, they were present. In how he spoke. In how he listened. In how he showed up. So instead of feeling ease around him, she felt something else. Not something obvious. Just pressure. And because she couldn't explain it, she didn't confront it. She simply pulled back. Now here's where things changed. He stopped trying to fix the relationship. Not out of frustration, but out of awareness. He stopped overthinking his words. He stopped trying to control every interaction. He let go of the need for immediate closeness. And instead, he focused on his state. Calm. Grounded. Unpressured. He didn't chase conversations. He didn't try to create moments. He simply showed up, differently. And within weeks, something shifted. Conversations became lighter. Responses became warmer. The tension that once filled the space disappeared. Not because he said something new, but because he stopped bringing pressure into the connection. Another example. A woman struggled in social situations. Not because she lacked communication skills, but because she constantly monitored herself. She would think before speaking. Analyze how she sounded. Adjust her behavior in real time. And while she believed this made her better socially, it had the opposite effect. Interactions felt unnatural. People responded politely, but not openly. Conversations stayed surface level. And she couldn't understand why. Because again, on the surface, she was doing everything right. But underneath, there was insecurity. A need to be accepted. A fear of being judged. A constant internal pressure to perform well. And that state was being felt by others. Not consciously, but emotionally. So even though her words were fine, her presence felt slightly tense. Slightly controlled. Slightly unnatural. And people responded accordingly. Not with rejection, but with distance. Now here's what changed. She stopped trying to manage how others saw her. She stopped rehearsing her words internally. She allowed herself to be present, without constant adjustment. At first, it felt uncomfortable. Because she was used to controlling everything. But over time, something shifted. Her conversations became easier. Her presence became lighter. People started engaging with her more naturally. Not because she improved her communication, but because she removed the pressure behind it. And then there's something even simpler. A small, everyday example. Think about a time when you were trying to get a specific response from someone. Maybe you wanted them to agree, to understand, to react a certain way. And you subtly pushed for it. You explained more. You emphasized your point. You tried to guide the conversation toward a specific outcome. And what happened? They resisted. Not aggressively, but subtly. Shorter responses. Less openness. Less engagement. Now compare that to a moment where you had no need to control the outcome. You spoke freely. You didn't push. You didn't need anything from the interaction. And notice what happens there. People open up more. They engage more. They respond more naturally. The difference isn't in what you said. It's in what you carried while saying it. Pressure versus ease. And people always feel the difference. These examples aren't rare. They happen every day. In relationships. In friendships. In conversations you barely notice. But most people overlook the pattern. Because they're trained to focus on the visible. Words. Actions. Behavior. Not the invisible. State. Energy. Presence. But once you begin to see it, you can't unsee it. You start noticing how certain people feel easy to be around, while others feel heavy. Not because of what they say, but because of how they are. And that realization changes everything. Because it shows you something simple, but powerful. You've never just been communicating with words. You've always been communicating with your state. And the moment that state shifts, everything around it begins to shift as well. So how do you actually use this? Not as an idea. Not as something you understand once and forget. But as something that changes how you show up every day. It starts in the moments where you normally react automatically. The moments where you feel that familiar pressure. Where something feels off. And your instinct is to fix it immediately. That's your first signal. Not to act faster. But to pause. Not a long pause. Just enough to notice what's happening inside you. The tension. The urgency. The need for things to go a certain way. And instead of following that, you step back internally. You don't suppress it. You don't fight it. You simply become aware of it. Because awareness breaks the pattern. Then, ask yourself something simple. What am I bringing into this right now? Not what you're saying. Not what you're doing. But what you're feeling. Is it pressure? Is it fear? Is it a need for control? Just noticing it begins to loosen it. And from there, you shift. Not dramatically. Just slightly. From tension to calm. From urgency to patience. From control to openness. And then you act. But now, your action comes from a different place. In conversations. Stop trying to guide the outcome. Stop trying to be perfectly understood. Speak clearly, but without force. Let your words land, without pushing them. Because when there's no pressure behind them, they carry more weight. In moments of uncertainty. Stop trying to solve everything immediately. Give space. Not to avoid the situation, but to allow clarity to come without tension. Because clarity doesn't come from pressure. It comes from stillness. In relationships. Stop monitoring every reaction. Stop adjusting yourself constantly. Be present, without trying to control how you're perceived. Because the moment you stop performing, you become real. And people respond to that. Now here's the part that matters most. Consistency. Not perfection. You don't need to get this right every time. You just need to notice it and return to it. Again and again. Because over time, this stops being something you practice and becomes something you are. You become someone who doesn't react from pressure. Someone who doesn't try to control every outcome. Someone who doesn't carry tension into every interaction. And when that happens, everything around you changes. Not instantly, but naturally. People feel more at ease around you. Conversations become smoother. Connections feel lighter. Not because you've learned new techniques, but because you've changed your state. And this is where the identity shift happens. You're no longer the person who overthinks every interaction. You're no longer the person who tries to fix everything immediately. You're no longer the person who seeks constant reassurance from others. You become grounded. Calm. Certain. Not loud. Not forceful. Just steady. You don't chase connection anymore. You allow it. You don't force understanding. You create space for it. You don't try to control how others feel about you. You focus on how you feel within yourself. And that changes how others experience you. Because when there's no pressure in your presence, people relax. When there's no need behind your words, people listen. When there's no tension in your energy, people open up. And suddenly, the same situations that once felt complicated feel simple. The same interactions that once felt heavy feel natural. Not because the world changed, but because you did. And maybe the most important shift of all is this. You stop seeing yourself as someone who needs to fix everything. And you start seeing yourself as someone who influences everything. By the state you carry. That's real control. Not forcing outcomes, but shaping the environment through your presence. Quietly. Consistently. Powerfully. So the next time you feel that familiar tension, that urge to fix, control, or force something into place, pause. Not because you're unsure, but because you understand. And choose differently. Because in that moment, you're not just changing your reaction. You're changing the entire dynamic. And once you live from that, you'll realize something most people never do. They were never struggling because of what you said. They were responding to what you silently carried. And the moment you change that, everything else begins to follow.